Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is Photographing Whales, Gardeners of the Ocean, with Nat Hab expedition leader and pro photographer Anthony Amsel. Thank you so much for being here today, Anthony. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Brooke, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I am so excited to be sharing two of my passions with you today, obviously whales and photography. Before we get into it, how about I just jump into a little bit more about me? As Brooke mentioned, I am an expedition leader and photography expedition leader with Natural Habitat Adventure. I very much focus on the north. I like the cold, apparently, which makes sense because I am a true Canuck, Canadian through and through. I very much dive into different regions across the country, including Churchill, where I do polar bears, and Northern Lights, which will be coming up momentarily, as well as some stuff on the Pacific coast and Haida Gwaii. I also have the very immense pleasure of working out of Greenland and Iceland. And a common theme between all of these things is water. Every single one of these destinations touches ocean in one way or another, which is very much where my passion for whales has continued. But it started back in my background as a wildlife biologist. For the last 15 years, I've had the pleasure of working with some of Canada's most notable wildlife species, including, of course, whales, as well as wolves, bears, and some wetland critters like turtles and snakes. But today we are very much going to focus on the gentle giants of the ocean realm. And outside of that, of course, photography is a huge passion of mine that started off when I was a wee lad and has developed very much into a career. So wherever I go, I very much have my camera and my lens with me at the ready to go. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Today's goals, we're going to fine tune some whale photography. I'm sure some of you have already had the pleasure of being on a boat and trying to take some pictures of whales. Some of you may not have. Today, we're going to jump into some tips to kind of fine tune everything. We're also going to see how photography can be used for conservation purposes, because it is fun to snap pics here and there, but it's always a lot more fun when there is a theme and a purpose behind that. And we're going to explore very much why that conservation is important and why whales are considered the gardeners of the ocean. All right, topic number one, photography for whales. Now, in my bag, this is typically what I will be using. Of course, everybody is different. Every recipe is different because everyone likes a different product. However, most of the time when I'm out there, I will have a telephoto lens because sometimes those whales will be pretty far off in the distance and you're going to need that extra telescopic power to get you where you need to go. I also have a mid-range lens that allows me to have a little bit more flexibility as there is an approach towards the whales or as the whales approach us. Keeping in mind that it can get a little tricky to jump between lens when you're in a vessel, especially if there's choppy water, especially if it's raining, especially if the conditions aren't necessarily what you would like them to be. So that is something to keep in mind when you are having your lens choice in front of you. If there's a lot of room on the vessel and you have somewhere, for example, inside where you can bring your bags and you have room for all your equipment, by all means, bring as many lenses as you want. But sometimes when you're on a small Zodiac, you don't necessarily have that option. But most importantly is the dry bag. It is the number one tool that I bring with me because, again, you're out there right in front of all the elements. So whether it's the spray coming from the water of the ocean, whether it's the rain coming from the sky, you want to keep your equipment nice and dry at all times. But beyond photography, beyond just the equipment that you might use to snap your pictures, binoculars are very much an essential tool. And that is because before you can even snap pictures, you need to be able to spot whales. And we're going to be talking about that in a few moments. So binoculars are some things that I always have strapped around my neck, ready to go so I can see what's on the horizon. Now, phones. Phones are also a very, very crucial element because sometimes those whales get a little bit too close for your lenses, and having a phone by your side is really nice because not only can you take pictures of the whales, but hopefully you might be able to get a selfie with a whale. It's something that I always like to strive for with my guests whenever we're on trip. Apart from that, extra batteries, those are so important. Sometimes it can be cold out there. That can drain the battery very quickly, or sometimes it won't have charged the way you want it to. It's always nice to have that extra battery just in case. Now, those are the essential tools that I have. There's some accessory things that I might have in my bag. I don't always carry them. Some people like to have them, some people don't. And those are the two items that we see at the bottom of the screen. So a polarized lens. This is a tricky one because when you're on the water, the glare from the sunlight can actually make things a little bit harder to see through the water. What the polarized lens will do is exactly what polarized sunglasses will do. It'll cut through that glare, and like you can see in the picture on the bottom of the screen, it'll help you see through the water. That being said, you have to keep in mind you've probably spent a few hundred, if not a few $1,000s for a very, very good piece of glass on your lens, and then you're putting a much cheaper piece of glass at the very front of that. So without a doubt, it will decrease the quality of your pictures a little bit. However, it will maybe offer you the opportunity to cut through that glare in the water. Now, with today's post-processing software like Lightroom, for example, which is my software of choice, it's a lot easier to compensate for those things in post-production. But if you're someone who doesn't want to deal with that, you don't want to deal with all the editing and all the software and all that jazz, polarized lenses can be a good solution for you. The second thing is a rain cover. That is something that I've started utilizing more and more. Again, it's not always on my camera lens. It's not always in my bag. However, it is something that might be worth using. Again, because of that ocean spray, because of the rain. If it's a really, really bluebird day, the sun is out, everything is nice and calm on the water, you might not need it. But this gives you a general idea of what I will typically have in my bag and what I've seen most people bring out on the water. Again, every single person is different and everyone has an equation that works for them. The most important thing out of all of this is to make sure that you're comfortable with the gear you have, you know how to use it, and you're happy using it. Now, let's talk about camera settings. We're not going to dive too much into this because there's only really three things I want to chat about very quickly. The first one is your camera priority. Now, if you're someone who doesn't want to deal with that, going into auto is never a bad idea. Sometimes that's all you need, especially if you have a smaller compact camera or anything along those lines. However, if you want to play around a little bit more, kind of get complex, a little bit spicy, if you will, there are three other modes that you can go in. The first one is shutter priority, because your shutter speed will be something that, again, we're going to be talking about in a few moments, but is something that you really want to utilize as much as possible. That also goes with sport mode, which will, again, put an emphasis on your shutter speed. Otherwise, you can go full manual. That is something that I typically tend to do because I like to play around with my settings right off the get-go. But most importantly, we want to talk about shutter speed. You generally want to be on a high shutter speed, like the nice little rectangle at the bottom of the screen shows. If your subject is moving pretty quickly, if you have a high shutter speed, it'll be nice and crisp. If you have a low shutter speed, you're going to get that blur action. Now, don't get me wrong, whales don't move that quickly, although sometimes they can be surprising. For example, if you get a fin whale, also called the greyhound of the seas, just roaming past you, they are quite speedy. But more importantly, you're going to be on a boat. That boat is probably going to be moving, whether it's because of the swell, whether it's because of the chop, whether it's just you moving your camera back and forth. Having a high shutter speed will compensate for all of these things. More importantly, sometimes you don't necessarily know where a whale is going to pop up. If it pops up to your left while you're looking towards the right and you hear it come up, moving that camera very quickly, again, having the high shutter speed will compensate for the quick movement that you have ahead of you. And the zoom. A lot of people tend to zoom in on their subject, which is something that we typically do. It's an inherent reflex. However, what I always like to tell people is you can always crop your pictures. You can always do that. You don't need any fancy software editing tools. All you need is to be able to cut and copy, and you're pretty much ready to go. So when you're out there, you want to keep in mind that having a nice kind of more landscape approach to whale photography might be something you want to keep in mind, because what I have often been a victim to is zooming in much more than I needed to. And when that whale popped up, I didn't get the shot I wanted because I was far too close. Sometimes that means that I would get half of a whale tail, or I get only part of its body in my shot. And although it is kind of nice to be up close and personal, sometimes you want to keep in mind what your subject is going to look like. Okay, now that we have talked about camera settings, we've talked about what's in our bags, we are ready to jump onto the water and go do some whale photography. Something we very much want to be aware of, though, is responsible whale watching. It is such a thrill, but also a privilege to be in the realm of whales when we're on the water. Now, regardless of whether or not you're in a small zodiac, like the red one on your screen, or a much larger vessel, you want to keep in mind the companies that you're going out with. Because again, we're in their habitat, they're not in ours. A responsible whale watching company will always make sure that they put the whales first. And that's what we want, because the last thing that is needed is a stressed whale that is thrashing in the water, because it's not a fun time for anybody. Now, once we have that, we can start having a little bit of fun. But of course, we need to spot whales. And again, this is where binoculars come in handy. One of the best ways to spot whales are the whale blows. Now, the chart that you see on your screen are different blows from different species of whales. We're not going to go through every single one, but some of the ones that are fun to point out are the blue whale, like the whale that we see on the screen. They have one of the most powerful blows in the ocean. You can see it very much tower into the sky. Keep in mind that this blow is actually the air coming out of their lungs. It is incredibly fast. There are other species like the humpback whale that have more of a balloon shaped blow. And then you have right whales, like on the bottom, which have a heart shaped blow. Those are just ways to identify whales. But more importantly, you just want to look on the water and scan with your binoculars until you see something blow. And then you can have a lot of fun with your photography in terms of how far that whale is, in terms of taking pictures. Another really important thing to keep an eye for is the presence of birds. Birds are very, very good at spotting fish from the air. And oftentimes, if you see a lot of birds together, like this grouping of gulls, there's a good chance that there is some food there, some little fish, maybe some krill. And that is also the prey of whales, which means that sometimes if you keep your lenses on that area, so you've checked with your binoculars, you've seen birds, your eyeballs are now targeted on the birds, you bring your lens up. If you're lucky, maybe you'll get a whale like this bride's whale over here that just pops out of nowhere, because it is out there feeding just like the birds. And again, that's why you always want to be ready and you want to have that high shutter speed, because things happen very quickly on the water. Now, if you're on the Pacific Ocean on the west coast of North America, there is a chance that you might see, or you probably may have heard of bubble net feeding. It is a very particular behavior that is seen in humpback whales, where they basically cage fish in this wonderful cage of bubbles. And when they come up to the surface, it is an absolutely dazzling show and spectacle. These behemoth giants of the water just coming out seamlessly and opening their large mouths to be able to get fish. And again, having that camera ready to go when you see those bubbles and those birds will allow you to get these beautiful shots. Now, let's talk about some whale behavior, shall we? Because, of course, spotting the whales is one thing, seeing them come up when there's birds is another thing. But as you get closer to them in your vessel, or in a responsible way, sometimes when the whales come close to us, there are different behaviors that you can start looking at to be able to maximize the type of shot you're going to get. The first one I want to talk about are whale footprints, like the one we see in this picture here. So obviously in the top of the image, we have the whale, and then behind it is its footprint. Every time it comes up for a breath and goes back down underneath the surface of the water, it displaces an incredibly large amount of water, which creates a vacuum. And that water becomes stagnant in a very circular fashion. It's not always a perfect circle, but close to it. And that is a footprint. Generally speaking, whales will leave footprints before they dive back into the water. And you can tell where that whale is going to go based off of the footprints, the same way you would track an animal in the snow. So it gives you a hint as to where the whale might pop up based off of the distance between the footprints and the direction. So you can kind of follow with your lens to see where that whale might pop up. The next one is diving. So typically whales, depending on their size, will come up for different amounts of breaths before going back and plunging into the depths of the water. Here we have two humpback whales. They've come up for a couple of breaths, and now they're getting ready to dive. And this is the crux. This is what people typically wait for, because humpback whales are one of the few species that will generally show their flukes, also called tails, before they dive into the water. And the big difference that we can see here is in the top image, the whale's backs are very flat, versus in the second image, the whale's backs are very, very curved. When you see a curved back like that, it means that typically speaking, the whale is getting ready to dive. Now, every species will curve its back like this or close to it before diving. But again, humpback whales are one of the few species that will very much show their tails. That's because most of the mass in their bodies are at the very front of their bodies, and they really need to push down vertically to be able to go as deep into the water as possible to get their food. So once we kind of clue in to these different behaviors and the way the animals move in the water, you can set up your camera to be able to get beautiful shots of these tails, like the ones that we have here, whether it's from the front or from the back. And again, as you can see, these tails are very different. They have different markings. Every single humpback whale has a unique pattern on the front and on the back of its tail, kind of like the fingerprint that you have on your fingers and on your toes. That is how we're able to identify humpback whales. And it creates these beautiful mosaic of patterns on each animal. Let's talk about lunge feeding. So we talked about diving. Lunge feeding is another way that animals, specifically whales, of course, will come up to feed. If there is a lot of food at the surface of the water, what you'll typically see a whale do, like the minke whale that we have here in front of us, is these whales will come to the surface and they will very much push forward. They'll open up their mouths and they will just push all of their bodies and just scoop up as much as they can. When they start lunge feeding, they'll typically do it a few times before diving back into the water. It does require a lot of energy to do, so they'll try to maximize their efforts as much as possible before going back under the surface of the water. Breaching, this is a very big one. This is oftentimes the ultimate shot that people are trying to get. I won't necessarily dive too much into the why behind whales breach. There's a lot of different theories about it. I like to say, why not? It looks like a lot of fun. If I was a whale, I'd probably like to breach as much as possible. Imagine being this big animal coming out of the water and just feeling weightless for just a couple of seconds in the air before you come crashing back down. When it comes to breaching, though, what's important to note is that oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, whales will breach more than once in relatively the same area. So what that means is if you see a humpback whale that breaches from the corner of your eye and your lens isn't ready, don't fret too much and don't put your cameras back down. Keep them up in the same general direction where that whale just breached from, because there is a good chance that that whale will breach once again. Sometimes they can do it several times. The last group I had in Iceland, actually, we were very lucky. We were driving down the coast and we spotted a humpback whale that was breaching. We decided to stop on the side of the road. We were very much on the coast. The whale was maybe about a mile out, and that whale ended up breaching about 17 times in a row. It was an amazing, amazing spectacle. But they aren't the only species that do that. On the other side of the panel here, we have a minke whale. They are also known to breach. I have even been lucky enough to see a blue whale breach. It looks like an awkward sandwich because they're so massive, they kind of just fold on themselves. But most importantly, if you're thinking about photography, keep your lenses in that area because there's a chance that they might breach several times. Unfortunately, sometimes that's not always the case. Sometimes it's only once and it's a once and done, and you're lucky if you get to see it with your eyes, even luckier if you're able to get your lens on it. Now, large groups. I've included dolphins here because dolphins are still whales. They are cetaceans. And when you're on the water, if there are whales, there's sometimes an opportunity to see dolphins. Again, in Iceland on the same trip, we actually saw this beautiful pod here of dolphins that were swimming around the boat. From a photography perspective, though, it can be incredibly overwhelming when you have these large pods of dolphins just swimming all over the place. It becomes almost a frenzy and you become super excited. It's hard to target and focus your lens on specifically one group because they're all over the place. So what you can do though is look for different behaviors, stuff that stands out. For example, this little dolphin, the back of the group here, seemed to be spy hopping quite a bit. Again, spy hopping is this behavior where the animal will come out of the water. It won't do a full breach. It'll just come out a little bit to see what's going on above the surface. And what you can do is focus on individuals like that and see their patterns. Because by doing so, instead of being overwhelmed by the sheer amount of animals in front of you, you very much focus on one behavior, which allows you to set up shots like this. So again, you keep your lens on that specific individual as it's moving around. And then if you're lucky enough with your high shutter speed, once again, you'll be able to catch some beautiful, beautiful shots of these animals just displaying what they're able to do. In the same vein, family units, super, super, super important to look out for. And what I mean by that is oftentimes you'll see family units in these large groups. It also happens with whales, for example, a mother and a calf. And why this is important is because the lungs on these smaller animals are obviously much smaller than their adults, which means they need to come up for air more often. They can't hold their breath as long as their parents can, which means that you have more opportunities to be able to take photography. So, for example, here, this was the same group of dolphins that we saw in Iceland in Ísafjörður. And this beautiful, beautiful baby dolphin that we see right in the center was coming up quite often. So I was able to swing my camera around and snap a couple of shots of this beautiful, beautiful baby dolphin and its parents just roaming right through the waters. Now that we've talked about animal behavior, I want to switch gears a little bit now and talk about how we can start really formulating our pictures more than just snapping. When I started doing whale conservation in the St. Lawrence estuary, I always had my camera out. I'd come home with over 2,000, 3,000 pictures from just a day out on the water, which is oftentimes what we tend to do. I still very much do that because I get so excited when I see whales. However, it is a very arduous task to go through every single one of those pictures and pick out, the best sellers, which is why you want to start thinking a little bit more about the background that you have, the composition that's available, the lighting. So maybe instead of just taking pictures for picture's sake, you can start having a more artful approach to when you're taking those snaps. For example, here on your screen, you have a fin whale and a minke whale. And again, they are beautiful, beautiful creatures. Whenever I see a picture of a whale, it just warms my heart. But you can take it a step further and you can start thinking about the scene around you. For example, you have this beautiful humpback whale here that has just come to the surface of the water. It just blew out the air from its lungs. And because of the sunlight that was going through that, it just created this beautiful veil almost right atop of the humpback. Some people have even noticed this picture and told me that it almost looks like someone's standing with this veil behind them, almost like a wedding dress. But more importantly, if you look behind that, you'll look to see that the ocean and the sky meet in a very interesting manner because they're almost the same texture, almost the same color. So those are things you want to start thinking about. Again, it can be very easy to zoom in on the tail of a whale or on its dorsal fin, but it's fun to kind of think about the surroundings and the landscapes and the habitat that this animal is in. Same thing with this other humpback whale that was doing a little bit of tail slapping. That's a behavior that we don't fully understand yet. Sometimes it can be a defense mechanism. A whale saying, hey, you're too close to me, please stay away. Sometimes it can just be for fun. This is a whale that actually approached our vessel when you were just staying very stagnant. The engine was idling and the humpback itself came to see us, started doing pectoral fin slapping, tail slapping. And behind what we see is actually a very, very thick mass of fog. But because of that fog and because of the sunlight, it created this really interesting contrast between a almost warm kind of sunny background and the cool, cold, crisp colors of the ocean water around the whale. So again, just things to keep in mind when you're on the boat and you're at a point where you've taken, hundreds of pictures of its back or its fin or its tail and start thinking about what other possibilities you have. Now, with that in mind, we can even become a little bit more complex. You can start telling a story with your pictures. It can be a single frame or it can be multiple frames that will tell different chapters in these animals' lives. For example, here we have a fin whale that's blowing right in front of a lighthouse. This is one of the very first lighthouses on the water in North America. It's in the St. Lawrence estuary. And the story here that we're able to tell is that these whales are very much in a human environment, or rather, the humans are very much in a whale environment. They're very much surrounded by human infrastructure, and there's a coexistence that is created there. In a similar vein, over here, we have a beautiful fluke, the backside of a humpback whale that was diving relatively close to this big ocean liner that we see. Again, these two pictures were taken in the St. Lawrence estuary, which is also very much the area of the St. Lawrence Seaway where you have multiple massive ocean liners that are just coming back and forth every single day. So here we can very much see that kind of complex relationship between whales in that area feeding and very much the human presence of infrastructure and boats just coming back and forth every single day. Now, beyond that, there are interspecies interactions that we can start looking at. Again, I mentioned how your story can be a single frame or it can be multiple shots that come together to tell a specific story. I do just want to throw out a very quick discretion here. Where you're going to see our scenes of predation. So if anyone has a queasy stomach or doesn't want to see that, there's nothing too bloody, there's nothing too gory, I assure you. But it is still one animal predating another one. So it's only one slide, but I'll be sure to tell you when it's over. Over here, we actually have a gray seal that is predating a harbor porpoise. So yes, a harbor porpoise is one of the smallest whales on the planet. It's only about 6 feet in length when it is a full adult. Gray seals can be a little bit bigger than that, actually. They're quite contentious predators. In this particular scene, what we were seeing is actually a gray seal that came out of nowhere. And when I was doing some research with the whales, we actually saw something fly up into the air, and we saw this porpoise, and it seemed to be very unusual behavior. When we looked again, what we noticed was that it was actually a gray seal that was catapulting this porpoise into the air, trying to stun it. And eventually, when it was able to grab hold of it, it held on to its fins with its mouth. And eventually, what we saw is as the gray seal was looking at us and we were staring back, that gray seal was very much starting to predate this unfortunate harbor porpoise. But again, that is the circle of the marine life, if you will. It's what happens. And it was a very interesting situation to see. It hadn't very much been documented before. So we were incredibly lucky to be on the water for this. And again, this is where your high shutter speed really comes into play. If it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have been able to snap these incredible pictures of this predation that was happening. For those of you who may have closed your eyes for a moment, I can assure you that is done now. I mentioned how phones are really important. They're a great tool. Almost every single person has one now, especially in North America. So when you're out on trip, it's always nice and handy to have them close by because, again, those long telescopic lenses are really good when whales are pretty far away. But as things get closer, it can become more and more complex to take a crisp picture and have exactly the framing that you want. Oftentimes, when a whale comes within about 100 feet or so, I usually have my hand on my camera, but I have my other hand very close to my pocket, just in case I want to bring my phone out, because these animals can get quite close. In this picture right here, there's a bottlenose dolphin that came right by our vessel. It was right underneath us, basically. There was no way I would have been able to take a good picture. My camera lens was just too zoomed in. I probably would have been able to get a gray spot and no one would have known what it was. So just snapping a quick picture with my phone allowed me to have this wonderful image, as well as these two other dolphins that started just porpoising right by us. Porpoising being a term, by the way, of animals when they come out of the water, they're not doing a full breach. They're traveling as they're moving, but they do come out quite a bit. The other reason why phones are fun is because you can grab some great video with them. Here we actually have a pod of 12 fin whales that are surrounding us. You can hear the excitement of everyone, of course. For context, fin whales are the second largest animal on the planet. So you can imagine how having 12 of them right near you with a telescopic or a mid-range lens would be incredibly difficult to end up with a wonderful picture that you want. So having your phone allows you to really capture that scene and that emotion, which you wouldn't necessarily be able to do with your lenses. Okay, we're going to switch gears now. We covered the first part, which is photography of whales and how to kind of fine tune your skills. I'm very much someone that over the years of diving into photography have been convinced that it's important sometimes to think about intent, to think about the purpose and the reasoning behind what you're doing. Photography has become such an incredible tool for science and conservation. And across the world, there's so many organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, that use photography to be able to help them in terms of better understanding what's happening with life across this planet, and especially in this case, in the water. There is this great application and website called Happy Whale that I highly encourage everybody to look into, because what they do very simply is they take on all the pictures that people send them from around the world. So you're able to submit your pictures of the beautiful whales that you see. What the organization does is then identify those pictures based off the unique markings. Again, those flukes, the whale's tails, are very unique identifiers. And in their database, they are very much capable of compiling all of the data that they are able to gather, and they're able to see where these whales go. And what the organization does is actually track all these pictures across the world. I had a guest on one of my trips in Iceland 2 years ago who submitted a picture of a whale that he saw while we were on trip, and he actually messaged me a few weeks later telling me that he had submitted it and he was hoping to see where it would go. And then about a year later, they notified him that they saw the same whale in the Caribbean. And of course, this is super exciting, not only because it means that they were able to spot the whale in different parts of the planet, but more importantly, is that there is a purpose behind this. And as we can see so far today in 2025, there have been close to a million photos that have been submitted. And you can see that from those photos that have been submitted, there are specific encounters that have been identified as well as individuals. And what this also means, though, is that you don't necessarily need to take all of these artsy pictures. I mean, of course, they're fun to do, but sometimes all you need is to take a clear-ish picture to be able to identify the whale's tail. Of course, if this was any more blurry, it would be very difficult for those at Happy Whale to identify the individual. But sometimes all you need to do is, again, snap a picture with your phone. You can submit it. Sometimes all you need as well are unique identifiers. Again, we have a fin whale here, and its dorsal fin that we can see is pretty regular, but more importantly, at the front of the whale, you'll see this kind of bluish hue. We call that its chevron. That's actually how fin whales are identified. So sometimes that's all you need. Or unfortunately, in the case of this other whale that was struck by a boat's propeller, you have very specific unique identifiers like the scarring on the side that again will allow the organization to be able to identify this individual no matter where it is on the planet. Humpback whales specifically as well, when we look at the dorsal fins, have individual dorsal fins that help identify it. They might look very similar, but as we can see, these are two very different individuals. On the one side, we have a dorsal fin that's very straight on both edges, and on the other one, very curved. This allows not only Happy Whale, but also researchers and other organizations to identify these beautiful, beautiful animals across the planet. Now, when we talk about real world impact, the map that we see that has all the blue on it, that is the Happy Whale map. Those are all the different displacements that we see between humpbacks, between fin whales, between all these wonderful creatures across the planet. What is amazing is that this is citizen science. It's everyday people who go on whale watching trips. It's researchers as well who are submitting these pictures, and it creates this global database. And organizations like the World Wildlife Fund are able to utilize a lot of what comes out from this research, from photography, to actually map out corridors that are extremely important and count as critical habitat for these whales, and are able to create maps like we see over here with all these different species, where they are, where they tend to go, where their migratory patterns are. And that information can then be used to create marine protected areas, either through federal organizations or through local organizations as well. So again, this photography is a lot of fun to do, but it can have a real world impact on a major, major, major scale. And that's really important because whales are not only such charismatic animals, they very much are an animal that has an impact on our everyday lives. And that's the next part of this presentation. We're going to get into a little bit more about whale conservation because, believe it or not, every single breath you take, regardless of whether or not you live on the coast, whether you live in the mountains, whether you live in the middle of the continent, every second breath can be traced back to whales. And let's explore that, shall we? More importantly, let's start off by really defining what whales are in terms of the keystone species. Here we have a beautiful humpback whale that's breaching, and a beluga, two different whales. One of them is a baleen whale. Those are the ones that have plates instead of teeth, and belugas are part of the toothed whales. As the name implies, obviously, whales with teeth. As a keystone species, they have a very, very large effect on the entire food chain. It is very much an effect that is completely more major than anything else you will see. The reason for that is they eat a lot. In fact, they are these massive animals, and yet they eat these tiny little things. For example, we have capelin in the hand of this young lady, and then we have krill, which you can see here look like tiny, tiny little shrimp. That is actually an adult krill, doesn't get much bigger than the tip of your pinky, but they are very salty and delicious. I have eaten them before. It's a great little snack if you're ever on the water. In fact, a humpback whale can eat about 1.5 tons of food per day, whether that is krill, capelin, or any other prey that they're looking for. That is a massive, massive amount. But more importantly, there's an interaction here. There's an interaction here that is so, so vital to the health of the ecosystem, not only in the ocean, but of the planet. And this is where the gardening methods come in. This is where we start really looking at how whales are the gardeners of the ocean. The first thing we want to look at is water movement. And what I mean by that is obviously there are different zones in the water. We have the photic zone. That's where sunlight will still have an effect on life in the water. So that goes down to about 200 meters, which is roughly 660 feet. We then have the twilight zone. So this is an area that still has a pretty high proportion of life, but is nowhere near as much as the photic zone. So again, we're going down to about 1,000 meters, which is roughly about 3,300 feet. And then we have the aphotic or the midnight zone, which is where you get all the kind of weird creatures that exist, that goes all the way down to the seabed. As whales feed, they'll follow the movements of their prey, which means that sometimes they'll be very close to the surface, but sometimes if their prey, like krill, for example, is very low in the water column, these whales can dive down to about 200 meters or so, give or take. By going up and down, they are literally moving through the water and moving the water itself. They're moving the nutrients. For anyone who's done any gardening, either on a farm or in their backyards, think about it as churning up the soil. You're moving that around, you're moving the nutrients. Whales are doing very much the same thing over here. And of course, there's also horizontal displacement. So we see 3 stars up here. Those are 3 main regions where you'll typically see a lot of whales in the summer. You have obviously the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, which is right below Labrador and Newfoundland. You have in the area of Greenland, and you have in the area of Iceland, all places where Nat Hab either currently has trips or has had trips. In the summer, whales will come to this area because they are so highly productive in food that they will spend 20 hours a day just feeding nonstop. Of course, they take some naps here and there because feeding and eating is a tiring activity. Think about any holiday food that you may have had recently and meal. You can think about the food coma you're in afterwards. But once winter rolls around and conditions change completely, these whales will migrate towards the south, either going towards the Caribbean, like the Dominican Republic, or right off the coast of Africa. In doing so, they're also moving nutrients from one region to another. So all the way from the Caribbean, all the way up to Greenland, or all the way from Iceland, all the way down to the coast of Africa. And of course, this is only the Atlantic Ocean, but you can think of that on a global scale, as well as all the whales in the southern hemisphere, for example. There is a hypothesis that would state that all of the whales on this planet, so we're thinking about all the tens of hundreds of thousands of whales, including dolphins, including porpoises, including all those wonderful, wonderful animals, all of them moving through the water has the same effects on nutrient cycling as all the movement of the water in the ocean itself. So we're talking about the tides, we're talking about waves, we're talking about rip curls. So just to recap that in a different way, all of the whales on the planet, their movements, whether it's vertical or horizontal from one region, that nutrient cycling, so moving nutrients through the water, is equivalent or just about all the natural movement of the ocean itself. So that is a major, major, major impact. Now we've talked about movement, we got to talk about fertilizer. I'd like to introduce you to what we call whale fecal plumes. And a better way of saying that is poo clouds. Yes, what you're looking at is whale feces. Although it might not seem as appealing as that to many of you, this wonderful brown matter is absolutely, absolutely essential to the health of the ocean as well as the planet. Needless to say, it is worth a lot of money, both literally and figuratively. There are a lot of organizations that seek this specific material because it can be used in a lot of different cosmetics, for example. However, more importantly, it is valuable from an ecosystemic point of view. Again, if we think about those different zones that I mentioned earlier, even if a whale is down in the twilight zone, when it releases these plumes, they'll actually float back up to the surface because they have a lower density than water. And when they make their way up to the surface, this is what it looks like. This is a cloud of fecal plume that you might see around the area where a whale was in. Some whales will actually use this as a defense mechanism. For example, if they're being chased by orca, for example, or if a shark comes by, they might actually just jettison a fecal plume to kind of get away from their predators. Think about an octopus that jets out ink, just a different tactic, if you will. But more importantly, is what this is all made of, specifically iron, phosphorus, and nitrogen. Now, don't worry, we're not going to turn into a chemistry class here. But more importantly, if you think about iron, phosphate, and nitrogen, for those of you who, again, have either farmed or done any sort of gardening in your backyards or front yards, you might recall, you might have thought about where this comes from and what it's in, specifically fertilizer. It's literally almost the same thing. So instead of going out to your local home hardware and buying a big bag of fertilizer, think about a whale just ejecting that into the ocean. Now, the reason that's important is phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are basically the smallest organisms that you will find in the water. And they feed off of these very nutritious fertilizing plumes that you see in the water. So again, think about any little types of microbes that you might have in your garden, on your farm, or anything along those lines. It is the same thing in the water. You have these vegetative microorganisms that sometimes can be either one cell or multiple cells that are roaming around in the oceans, very much at the mercy of the tides and the currents, and they need to feed. And what they feed on are all of these wonderful nutrients in the water. A large part of that is actually those fecal plumes. Now, what we see here are phytoplankton blooms. So the image that we see with the coast is actually right off the east coast of Greenland near Nat Hab's base camp. And this was obviously an image that was taken from a satellite up in the atmosphere. And what we can see is the bluish hues are all those phytoplankton blooms. So just keep in mind the scale of how big this is. The other image that we see is an infrared satellite imagery technology that was used to look at phytoplankton blooms in the North Atlantic Ocean. We can see how massive these things are. And you may have heard of algal blooms in lakes. This is not the same thing at all. We're not talking about anything in terms of toxicity or poisonous. We're talking about a very natural phenomenon that happens that is incredibly healthy, because not only are phytoplankton just great at doing a lot of things, they're at the very base of the food chain. Now, the image that was taken with infrared was actually used to generate and render a wonderful model of a phytoplankton bloom across the Atlantic Ocean that I would very much like to share with all of you. So what we're seeing here on the top left is actually Greenland. We're seeing the coast of Africa, and this is the North Atlantic Ocean and a absolutely marvelous phytoplankton bloom. And this is something that does happen on a regular basis when the production of the ocean is maximized. Now, again, we talked about how phytoplankton is very much at the very basis of the food chain. Phytoplankton will be eaten by zooplankton, so those are microscopic animal organisms, which are eaten by the krill, which feed the whales, and then the whales have those wonderful fecal plumes, which then feed the phytoplankton. So we can see this incredibly important cycle of life that we have going on here. So without the fecal plumes, we wouldn't have the phytoplankton. Without the phytoplankton, we wouldn't have the krill. And without the krill, we wouldn't have the whales. So again, a very delicate and very important cycle that we see going on. Carbon, this is the last kind of topic that I want to chat about in terms of ocean gardening, and probably the most important one. Phytoplankton not only are at the basis of the food chain, they also fix carbon. And what that means is you'll have all this carbon in the atmosphere. It'll go into the water, and just like plants that you have in soil, like trees, like flowers, phytoplankton will use that, will consume it on top of the fecal plumes to create sugars through photosynthesis. A very typical thing that we hear about in trees and flowers, again, on land. The same thing happens in the ocean. And why that's important is because that phytoplankton stores all the carbon, but it releases oxygen back into the ocean and therefore back into the atmosphere. And like I mentioned, every second breath that you take is indirectly linked to whales, because as those whales release those fecal plume, you'll get those wonderful phytoplankton blooms that release all of this oxygen back into the atmosphere that we breathe. So half of the breaths that you take come from the trees and the flowers and the grasses on land. The other half actually comes from phytoplankton and other vegetation in the ocean that releases oxygen back into the air. It happens on such an immense scale that it can actually change the climate. As we know, whales in certain countries are harvested, unfortunately, but that is a whole other debate. However, what a lot of models have shown is that before hunting happened, before harvesting happened, the oxygen levels in the atmosphere were actually quite a bit higher, because there was so much more phytoplankton that was being created from these fecal plumes from whales. And then when harvesting of whales started happening, you could actually see and note a slight change in oxygen levels in the atmosphere. And then when harvesting of whales started slowing down and numbers started popping back up, you can actually see how there was a little bit more oxygen in the atmosphere. So all that to say, whales and phytoplankton had this massive effect on the climate, and still very much do. Whales and phytoplankton still continuously regulate the climate that we currently are living in. So again, they're very, very useful to be able to combat climate change and changing conditions on our planet. So much so that one whale is actually worth thousands of trees. And what we mean by that is one whale can store enough carbon in its body and have an effect on phytoplankton to the point where it has the same effect as planting thousands of trees in a forest. Of course, this depends on the size of the whale. In this particular example, we have a blue whale, the largest organism on the planet. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't count out harbor porpoises and dolphins either. You look at all those numbers together, they still very much have the same effect as all the trees that we have on our planet, and grasses and flowers and shrubs and all of that good stuff. But not only is it because of the relationship with phytoplankton and storing carbon in the phytoplankton, but the whales themselves actually store carbon. So if you think about it again, phytoplankton will store carbon into its body that will be eaten by krill, which will be eaten by whales. That all accumulates. It's called bioaccumulation. And when a whale dies, it also takes all of that carbon with it as it falls to the seabed. In this image here, we have a skeleton of a whale that unfortunately met its end from natural causes, so we think anyway, and fell very much to the bottom of the ocean. We're talking thousands and thousands of feet, and with it has brought all of that carbon. And because conditions down there are so different than at the surface of the ocean, it takes a much longer period of time for decomposition to happen. On top of that, you have all these bottom dwellers like these octopi over here, and eels, as well as some wonderful sharks that all feed on this whale carcass. And then again, that carbon ends up being stored in all their bodies at the very bottom of the ocean and holding on to that instead of being released back into the atmosphere. Now, for a recap all that, because I realize that it's a lot of information, all we need to do is remember this in terms of how important whales are and how vital they are for the health of the planet. Phytoplanktons can absorb about 40% of global carbon emissions in the same way that trees and plants do on land, and they produce half of the world's oxygen. From that, again, they go into krill, they go into the whales, and the whale fecal plumes act as fertilizers and boost phytoplankton populations. And once those whales pass away, their bodies will make their way all the way down to the bottom of the ocean and will store as much carbon in there as possible for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And again, why this is important, why this is related to photography, and why I love those two subjects together is because photography of whales specifically has allowed for so much information and so many vital data sets to be shared throughout the world, throughout different organizations, to help with whale conservation, to create marine protected areas, and to be able to give whales so many more chances to continue living in the ocean, and for us, allowing us to be able to be in their presence and to have fun taking pictures of them. And I very much encourage you, the next time that you're on a vessel, whether it's a Nat Hab ship or anywhere else, to take a picture of a whale, to send it into Happy Whale, and to really contribute in your own way to the conservation of whales. And with that, I very much hope that you enjoyed this webinar. I know I had fun making it, and I want to thank Brooke and everyone at the Nat Hab team for having me on today. Brooke, I'll pass it back to you. All right, folks. I see that some of the questions are being looked at right now. So one of the questions that I heard was, what are some of my favorite whales? Oh gosh, that is a tricky question. They're all so amazing in different ways. I do love blue whales because they're so massive. They're just it's something else when you're near a blue whale. I talked about their blows and how powerful they are. I had this wonderful experience where I was able to escort a mother blue whale and her calf for about 4 hours or so, and I was working for the Canadian government. And we were so fortunate. We were keeping an eye on them because we were in the area where there was whale watching boats, and we wanted to make sure everyone respected their distances. And these two whales came out of nowhere, or so it seemed, because they have an amazing lung capacity that allows them to be underwater for, oh gosh, anywhere between 6 to sometimes 20 minutes or so, even more in certain cases. And this mother and this calf popped up on both sides of our Zodiac, and it sounded like cannons had gone off. And again, I had my camera in hand. I was just hoping to get a picture of this whale, and it turns out that it was too close for me to do anything. Even taking my phone out, I was so absolutely flabbergasted by what was going on. It's a really special experience. On top of that, I mean, orcas, killer whales are just this amazing species. On this picture, we actually see one that has seaweed on it. They're incredibly intelligent creatures, and what they can do sometimes is play around. Whales are known for playing. It's very much a social and behavioral thing that we see in them. Sometimes they'll go through seaweed beds and just carry them around, kind of the same way that we would play with a soccer ball. So again, it's really hard for me to pinpoint exactly which whale because they're just so amazing in every single right. Another picture that I see, or pardon me, another question I have here is how to stabilize your camera when you're on a moving boat. That is a great question. Um, it's hard to do. Stabilizing your camera when you're on a moving boat is incredibly difficult to do. It depends what kind of boat you're on, to be very honest. But I don't have a clear-cut answer because it also depends on the conditions. When it's a bluebird day and there's no waves on the water, it's incredibly easy. All you feel is a gentle kind of rocking back and forth. However, when you're in more inclement weather, one thing I like to tell people is if you're going to be standing up, first of all, be very careful because obviously you never want to fall into the water, not only because you'll get wet, but your camera gear will as well. But more importantly, what you can do is when you're standing up is to keep your knees bent. That is something that I absolutely implore people to do. It'll keep you as a human being nice and stable. It'll also help you with your photography. Again, that high shutter speed is something that will very much counteract swaying back and forth like that. A lot of my pictures, when I take them, don't end up straight like the ones that you've seen on screen. Oftentimes, they'll be tilted in a certain way or they'll be in a weird angle. And that's simply because of the swaying back and forth of boats. Speaking of which, if you do want to see more of the pictures I took, I encourage you to check out my website. It's www.anthonyamsel.com. So my first name, last name.com. You'll see a lot of pictures from whales, especially from Nat Hab trips, from Iceland, from Greenland, from everywhere in between. Some other things I'm seeing here pop up in terms of questions are when should I change my lens from a telescopic lens to a medium or a wide angle? Again, it's very tricky. Everyone has a different way that they like to do things. What I recommend is keeping an eye out for the whale's behavior. If you see that the whale starts off about a mile out, of course, a telescopic lens is so important. But if you see it starting to show up and get closer and closer, when it's maybe about half a mile out or even closer is when you can start thinking about changing your lens. Keep in mind your surroundings, keep in mind the ocean spray, because the last thing you want is ocean water getting onto your sensor. One of the ways I do it is I talked about dry bags. I typically will bring with me a very large dry bag that allows the space I need to be able to actually change my lens in the bag itself instead of out exposed to the environment, especially if there's ocean spray around. If you do end up getting ocean spray on your camera bodies or even your lenses, I highly encourage people to use a damp cloth with fresh water from a tap, for example, and just rinse off your camera lenses and your camera bodies after you get off the water. The reason for that is salt will very much deteriorate your gear and your equipment. It can have a really hard effect and important effect on everything from your zoom rings to your shutters to everything that you have. So again, rinsing off with a damp cloth is something I recommend. You definitely don't want to submerge your gear in any sort of water. That would just damage a lot of things. Some other questions that I see popping up here are very quickly, I think this will be the last one, then we're going to wrap things up. One of the questions I had was, where would I recommend going to see whales? Honestly, anywhere. There's so many beautiful places. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the gray whales in Baja. There's the trip in Haida Gwaii. There's, Greenland and Iceland. But more importantly is, again, making sure that you're always going with a company who does responsible and ethical whale watching. I'm very proud of the partners that we work with through Nat Hab, whether it's in any of those locations. And most importantly, have fun with it. Have fun with it, find your style, and enjoy that. With that, again, I want to thank everybody who attended today. I want to thank Brooke. I want to thank the Nat Hab team. And hopefully I will see you on the Nat Hab trip or out on the water. Enjoy, everybody, and have an absolutely great day.